Hi, I'm Charlie Melcher, founder and director of the Future of Storytelling, and I'd like to welcome you back to the FoST podcast. At this moment, we as Americans find ourselves in the midst of a national outpouring of rage and grief, centered on the tragic police killing of George Floyd and fueled by so many other events just like it. We at FoST are disturbed and outraged by these killings, as well as the outbreak of police aggression that we've seen in their wake. We stand with demonstrators around the country and the world in calling for a thorough and long overdue reform of the United States criminal justice system. Just one step in a long process of purging systematic racism from America's institutions. Furthermore, we believe deeply in the resounding truth that neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim, and that silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. We believe that every citizen, every organization, and every institution has a moral obligation to use what power they have to oppose injustice. We'll share some of the steps that we're taking to do our part in that fight at the end of this episode. But we would not exist as an organization and wouldn't be here speaking these words right now if we didn't truly believe that stories are a vital part of that fight. My guest today is both an embodiment and a champion of that truth. Van Jones, a graduate of Yale Law School, has a long list of professional accomplishments that include co-founding 6 nonprofit social justice organizations, hosting 4 documentary and political commentary shows on CNN, authoring 3 New York Times bestselling books, championing 2 landmark acts of Congress, and even working for President Obama as his Green Jobs advisor. As Van and I discuss in this episode, he credits much of his driving sense of mission and values to the stories that inspired him as a child, which also helped inspire his belief, as stated in the tagline of his production studio, Magic Labs Media, that the earth is made of stone, but the world is made of stories. For over 2 decades, Van has been using that belief in the power of stories, as well as a deep understanding of how to wield them, to build a better, cleaner, and more equitable future for all Americans. We recorded this episode several weeks ago, and so in it, we don't touch directly on what's currently happening in the streets all across America. Instead, our conversation examines the broader impact that stories can have through the lens of both Van's personal life and his professional work. And so, without further ado, I'm very honored to welcome Van Jones to the Future of Storytelling podcast. Van Jones, it's such an honor and pleasure to have you on the podcast today. Thank you for being here.
I'm honored to be here. It's great to see you.
So nice to see you again. So I read that as a kid, you read a lot of comic books.
Mm-hmm. True story.
Who were your favorite superheroes?
Well, the X-Men. I grew up when Marvel Comics were still mainly an underground phenomenon. You had to be a super nerd, a super geek to know who the X-Men were. And I mean, you were going to get a wedgie at some point that semester for sure, just by definition, if you knew any of that world and that universe. But I grew up as a skinny, nerdy, bookish, emotional kid on the edge of a small town in rural West Tennessee born in 68. So in the 70s, the 80s, when there was no upside for being a nerd. Now you can be a nerd, you can be a geek, it's cool, there's Silicon Valley, it works, there's Will.i.am, I mean, you can make it work. No, you were just a bully magnet with your, weirdo comic books and Dungeons and Dragons or whatever it was. It's trying to survive high school, and that's how I grew up.
Well, we shared that because I was a crazy Marvel collector. Like I lived for those. And favorites personally, yes, Daredevil, yes, X-Men, Luke Cage, Power Man, Iron Fist. Like the more obscure, the more I love to collect them and read them and consume them. Would you say that some of those stories and some of those characters were influential for you? Have they continued to live out and play out in your life?
I wouldn't say influential. I would say fundamental. The idea of the X-Men in particular, these kind of weirdo kids with these kind of special abilities, and they were sworn to protect a world that hated and feared them. Sworn to protect a world that hated and feared them. There's no better kind of framework for being an African-American activist, in the U.S. context than that. So you're in this world that doesn't appreciate you, maybe is afraid of you, and yet you've committed yourself, as the X-Men did, to like the most noble of purposes. The kind of power fantasy of the marginal nerd to be able to become something great and do something great is, I think, at the root of the whole comic book ethic, and it's my ethic.
And with great power comes great responsibility.
Absolutely. And Peter Parker and Uncle Ben telling him that.
Uncle Ben.
Yeah, Uncle Ben telling Peter Parker that. That is really my ethic. I have so much respect for Stan Lee. And I think that his ability to kind of humanize the genre, I think that was really important. And I took all of that in. The nobility of the heroic ethic of Stan Lee is my heroic ethic as well.
Nicely said. So I have a long relationship with you that you don't necessarily know about. So I was at the Bioneers Conference in 2003.
Wow, life changer.
Life-changing because I will never forget the speech that you gave there, where I came there as an environmental activist, and you opened my eyes to the need for social and prison reform and social activism, and you took those two movements and you tied them together. You literally said a movement that is courageous and visionary on the environment, but cowardly and ignorant about the social issues will fail. And I remember that, and I actually cried with you during that speech that you gave when you so honestly and authentically shared how passionately you felt about this and how moved you were, and there wasn't a dry eye in the house as you gave that talk. I mean, honestly, I was like, where did you come from? Where did you come from? And how did you learn to get up there and give that talk, like speak from the heart like that?
I appreciate that. Well, first of all, not easily. I had a speech impediment growing up. You can still hear remnants of it. I was incredibly shy, beyond shy. I grew up going to public schools. I grew up in the Black church. There's this thing in the Black church, and I'm not saying this to be racially offensive or divisive, but there is something called the Black church. If you've ever been in one, you know it ain't the same as a white church. And there's this sort of theological position that I just call the hallelujah anyhow position. No matter what's happened during the week, no matter how many times we've been mistreated or discriminated against or called horrible names or even lynched or even falsely accused or even jailed or killed, hallelujah anyhow. You're not going to steal our joy. You're not going to steal our dignity. Hallelujah anyhow. But because I grew up in such a weird place, Jackson, Tennessee, who's ever heard of that? Then I wound up going to law school at Yale, who hasn't heard of that? And then I moved to the Bay Area, and not to go work downtown for a big firm, but to work essentially in low-income communities with transgender people and homeless people and kids in trouble. And it all just kind of got shaken up inside of myself, and it kind of came out as this commitment to protecting things that are sacred no matter where they are. Like, I could see how the solution for the earth and the solution for people were the same thing. Solution for the planet, solution for the people, same thing. That you could fight poverty and pollution with the same thing. And then I got invited to go to Bioneers, and I just had so much to say. And when I got there, I looked out. That was probably the biggest audience I've ever spoken in front of. And I'm looking out, and it's clearly like mostly white, very affluent, but with these big hearts. And I'm thinking to myself, if I can just get these folks to care about these kids from Oakland, there's just nothing that we can't do. I mean, that was probably the most consequential speech of my life, because something just came pouring out of me into that moment, and it created ultimately the pathway that led me to the Obama White House and everything else. That was the farthest thing in our mind at the time. But that was a really, really important moment.
So it seems to me that you then went on this path. I know the whole story about going to the White House. I know the story about getting pushed out of the White House. And now most people know you because of the work you do on CNN as a political correspondent or commentator. But what people don't realize, because they don't think about commentators as getting shit done, right? They think about them as people who talk for a living and don't really do anything. And you are unbelievably effective as a person who gets important things done. There was the Green Jobs Act. Sorry, I don't remember the exact name of it from...
Sure. Green Jobs Act, 2007.
All right, I do remember it. Okay, and then the First Step Act, first big major legislation for prison reform in a decade. That was later in 2017. Is that right?
Yeah, and we got Trump 2018. We got Trump to sign it, which was unbelievable. It's so funny because the Green Jobs Act of 2007. We got George W. Bush to sign that, to get green jobs, all across the country. And then the First Step Act, the criminal justice reform piece, we got Trump to sign.
I mean, it's crazy. And also in an age when Congress is just like divided and in a standstill, right? Shut down because of the partisan rancor. And yet you've been able to get these major things passed or be an important part of doing that. What's the formula for getting real progress made?
I mean, what I have tried to do is look for the areas of common ground between the right and the left and put my work there. Now, that's a choice. It's not the only choice, not the only valid choice. There are people who have, and I think with great justification, said, listen, we can't be friends. You're snatching babies from their mothers at the border. You're trying to take away women's rights over their bodies. You're trying to exclude people from the country because they're Muslim. We're not going to be friends. I got to fight you. And so there are people who have gone to the battleground and they are fighting hard, and I respect that. That's important. I've played that battleground role in times in my life. But for me, in my heart, there are areas of common ground. And what happens is when you don't look for the common ground, the people who suffer the most are the poor, the marginal, the vulnerable, the addicted, the afflicted, the incarcerated. Those are the people who lose out. So we just built a liberty and justice for all movement, a left and right movement to get something done. And through the Dream Corps, which I founded, which has Cut 50, a bipartisan campaign on criminal justice, plus the Reform Alliance. I'm the founding CEO there, backed by Jay-Z, backed by Meek Mill, backed by Robert Smith, Robert Kraft, et cetera. We've passed, over the past 36 months, we've passed almost 24 criminal justice bills on a bipartisan basis, including in red states like Georgia. We got Trump to sign a bill, the First Step Act. It got 8,000 people out of the federal prison system earlier, with many more to come. Now the federal system is the smallest it's been in a couple of generations now. Doesn't mean that I don't fight Trump on the stuff I disagree with him on. Doesn't mean I'm going to vote for a Republican. But it does mean that on issues like criminal justice and addiction that hits both sides of the aisle, and generational poverty, which hurts people from Appalachia to the hood and the barrio and the reservation all the way back around, there are things we can work on together.
So let me ask you about one of the other things that you've built. You have a production company, Magic Labs Media, and I love the tagline for that company. The earth is made of stone, but the world is made of stories. If we want new facts, we need new fiction. Can you tell me a little bit why that's the tagline and how you came up with that?
It came to me in prayer. I pray a lot, meditate a lot. If people look at what's going on in the U.S. and maybe throughout the West politically with some horror, no matter what side you're on, just the level of divisiveness and dysfunction and disrespect is so high. This overwhelming narrative that the problem is somebody else and the solution is to smash them to bits, is everywhere in the culture. Is a spiritual problem and a cultural problem and a narrative problem. Well, then that's where we need to be putting a lot more energy and attention and time. And so, Magic Labs, we've got this virtual reality project where we let you be in the body of a small black child sitting on the front seat of a car. You blink awake, and you pick up your hands. Your hands are like the hands of a small black child. You look to your left, and your dad is a big black guy, Winston Duke, who played M'Baku in the Black Panther, Marvel movie. Mm-hmm. And he's your dad, and he's driving the car. And he's joking with you, and he's telling you funny stories, and everything's going great. And then the lights start flashing behind you, and you get pulled over. And you get to witness a reenactment of an actual traffic stop from the point of view of a small black child on the front seat of a car. And it's not gruesome, but it's very disturbing. And we took that virtual reality content, 2.5 minutes, to CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, with 6,000, 7,000 Trump supporters. And we had law enforcement people. So we have video of people taking off their MAGA hats and putting on our visors, taking off their NRA hats, their Make America Great hats, and putting on our visors. And 2.5 minutes later, going, wow, I literally never thought about what, when I use these police interactions, and of course I always, side more with law enforcement because I understand they got to protect themselves, they got their own families to come home to, but I just had never thought about what it would be like to be a child in that car with that happening to your dad. Now, that's not going to change the way anybody votes, but it can change it because it's not going to create political agreement, but it can create understanding. And that's what you can do with culture.
I love that you're using VR and experimenting with it. At the Future of Storytelling last year, the piece that won the FoST prize for Bridging the Divide, it was a category that we had, was a piece called I'm a Man, which was this beautiful interactive VR piece by Derek Ham. And you became a sanitation worker in 1968 in Memphis, peacefully marching with your sign that said, I am a man. It was a series of vignettes, and this is the strike, the sanitation worker strike that Dr. Martin Luther King came to support the strikers. And in the piece, he's assassinated. You don't see that, but it happens in the course of this piece. And so you go from being part of peaceful protests to an evening when there's riots in the streets. You, as a viewer, you are this African-American man. Again, you can tell from the color of your hands. And the piece ends with you on the streets now, and police cars pull up. It's evening. Headlights are focused on you, and the police come out and say, put your hands up. And you are placed in this moment of moral decision to physically raise your hands during this VR piece or not. And you're filled with the rage from what's happened and sadness, and that was an amazing, emotional, and empathetic moment for white guy who's not had the police point guns at him before, but probably for anybody really. Anyway, just another example of a similar kind of use of the medium for this purpose. I wanted to ask, you work so beautifully across so many media, right? Television, podcasts, radio, documentaries, journalism, VR. Do you have a favorite? Do you think that there's one that's more useful for the kind of influence and impact and change you're trying to accomplish?
Well, I appreciate what you said. I also written a couple of books I'm proud of. But
of course, 3 New York Times bestsellers.
All available on Amazon.com or wherever you buy books. It makes me proud to hear you say what you just said. I mean, given your role as kind of like the preeminent curator of this whole kind of world that I'm trying to be a part of. So I appreciate this acknowledgement. What I'm proudest of all the things I've been able to do in media, is an 8-part series, a docuseries I did called The Redemption Project. It didn't win any big awards. It didn't get great ratings, but it was the best that I could do in the the domain of television, commercial television. Very hard to do meaningful shit in commercial television. And what it was, we found instances of violent crime, and we found the victim, the person who had been hurt, or often the surviving family member, and we found the person who had done wrong. The person who had done wrong, sometimes it was vehicular homicide, sometimes it was a shooting, no sexual crimes, but crimes of violence. Once